In 370 YU, 1 BC on a dusty plain in central Greece, a sound rolled across the earth that had meant death for 300 years. Not the chaos of barbarian hordes, not the desperate screaming of untrained men. Something far worse. A rhythm. 1,700 bronze shields slamming together in perfect unison. Thousands of sandaled feet striking dry ground at the exact same moment. And cutting through it all, high and cold and thin, the shriek of bone flutes. That sound had carried the same message from one end of Greece to the other for longer than any living man could remember. The battle was already over. You just hadn't died yet. No army in living memory had stood against the Spartan phalanx on open ground and survived. This wasn't warfare. This was ritual. A death sentence delivered in formation by men who had been taught since childhood that they were not quite human anymore. They were weapons. Perfect. Unbreakable. Divine. For 3 centuries, Sparta had built itself into something more than a city. It was a religion of violence, a society that believed its warriors had crossed some fundamental line that separated ordinary men from instruments of organized killing. And for 300 years, nobody had proved them wrong. But today, on this unremarkable stretch of Boeotian dirt, that ancient truth was about to become a lie. For the sun moved another handspan across the sky, a Spartan king would bleed out in the dust. The most terrifying military force the ancient world had ever known would be dismantled in a single afternoon. And the man responsible would prove something that would echo through the next 2,000 years of human warfare. He would prove that invincibility is always an illusion, that every perfect system contains the seeds of its own destruction, that mathematics beats mythology every single time. His name was Epaminondas. And the weapon he carried onto that field wasn't bronze or iron. It was 10 years of patient observation. A mind willing to see what terrified men refused to look at. And the nerve to stake everything on a theory that every experienced commander in Greece would have called insane. But before we watch him kill a god, we need to understand what made that god seem immortal in the first place. The Spartan machine didn't begin on battlefields. It began in the dark. In the coldest hours before dawn, when boys barely 7 years old were ripped from their mother's arms and fed into a system designed to strip away everything soft and rebuild what remained into something that could stand in a formation and push forward while men died screaming on both sides. They called it the agoge, the upbringing. But that word was a kindness the system didn't deserve. What happened to those boys was closer to manufacturing than education. They were beaten, starved, forced to steal food and punished savagely if they were caught, not for stealing, but for being clumsy enough to get noticed. They learned to sleep on beds of reeds, to eat portions that left them perpetually hungry, to endure pain without making a sound. By the time a Spartan boy reached manhood, he had spent more than a decade learning a single lesson: that his individual life meant nothing, that his survival depended entirely on the man standing to his left and the man standing to his right, that the formation was everything. The formation was immortal. The formation could not break. The formation would not break, because if it did, everyone inside it would die. And when those boys grew into men and took their places in the phalanx, for the first time they discovered that everything they had been taught was true. Greek warfare in this era revolved around one brutal reality: the hoplite phalanx. Rows of armored men pressed so close together that their shields formed a continuous wall of wood and bronze. Each man carried a large round shield strapped to his left arm and gripped a 9-foot spear in his right hand. The shield didn't just protect you, it covered the exposed right side of the man standing to your left. Your life depended on his shield. His life depended on yours. When the phalanx advanced, it became a moving wall of overlapping defenses with spear points bristling from every gap. The front ranks absorbed the initial collision. The middle ranks pushed them forward with sheer physical weight. The rear ranks replaced the dead and kept the pressure constant. If the wall held, you walked away. If it cracked, you were crushed underfoot or stabbed in the back as you tried to run. Every major Greek city could field some version of this formation. Athens drilled it, Corinth fought with it, Argos bled for it, but Sparta had perfected it into something that transcended mere military technique. They had turned it into an expression of their entire civilization, a living manifestation of the belief that individual excellence meant nothing compared to collective discipline. And they had one other advantage that made them unstoppable. They had identified a flaw built into the bones of the phalanx itself, a weakness that every army in Greece shared. And instead of trying to fix it, they had weaponized it. The flaw was simple, unavoidable, human. That heavy shield locked onto your left arm left your entire right side feeling naked, exposed, vulnerable. Every man in the line unconsciously pressed a little closer to the shield of the man on his right, searching for cover that wasn't quite there. And the man beside him did the same. And the man beside him, multiply that tiny instinctive flinch across a line of 1,000 men, and the effect became enormous. As the phalanx marched forward, the entire formation drifted to the right, like a ship pulled by an invisible current. Most Greek generals treated this drift the way farmers treat rain. You couldn't stop it. You planned around it. You hoped the damage would be manageable. But Sparta didn't manage the drift. They built their entire battle doctrine around it. The Spartan king always took his position on the far right of the formation, exactly where the drift would push hardest and fastest. Surrounding him stood the royal bodyguard and the most experienced killers in the army. So the point of the phalanx that was already engineered by physics to strike first and deepest was also loaded with the most dangerous men on the field. Every time the line moved forward, that right wing became a battering ram swinging into the enemy's left flank with devastating, almost mechanical precision. Battle after battle, the same script played out. The Spartan right stacked with elite warriors slammed into the opposing left wing, which was almost never where the enemy placed their best troops. Those men were usually on their own right flank fighting the weaker Spartan allies in a more balanced contest. So the decisive collision always happened where Sparta was strongest and the enemy was weakest. The opposing left would buckle, then shatter. Then the Spartans would wheel inward, rolling down the exposed side of the enemy line like a door swinging shut. It became legend. It became expectation. It became a kind of gravity that no one in Greece seemed able to escape. Sparta didn't just win battles. They performed them the same way priests perform sacrifices. With ritual precision, with absolute confidence in the outcome, with the kind of certainty that comes from repetition, so perfect it stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like fate. And that certainty, that 300-year accumulation of unbroken supremacy, was exactly what one man in Thebes had been waiting for them to cultivate. Epaminondas was 51 years old in the summer of 371 BC. By the standards of his time, that made him old for active campaigning. Most generals who survived to his age had long since retired to advisory roles or politics. But Epaminondas wasn't most generals. He had spent the last decade of his life preparing for a single task. And that task required him to be on the field when it finally came. People who knew him described something rare. A man equally comfortable debating philosophy in the assembly and drilling infantry formations in the summer heat. Someone who studied war the way a surgeon studies anatomy. Not with passion or bloodlust, but with the cold precision of someone trying to understand exactly how a system functions so he can find the place where it fails. He had been 41 years old when Sparta occupied Thebes. For 3 years, from 382 to 379 BC, he had lived in a city controlled by Spartan garrison forces and ruled by an oligarchy installed at spear point. Most men would have spent those years in quiet rage or desperate plotting. Epaminondas spent them watching. He watched how Spartan officers drilled their men. He studied the formations they preferred. He observed the way they positioned their commanders. He paid attention to the tiny details other men ignored, the specific rhythm of their marching cadence, the standard depth of their ranks, the predictable patterns they fell into when assembling for parade or practice. And slowly, patiently, like a physician examining symptoms to diagnose a disease, he began to see the shape of their weakness. When democratic forces finally liberated Thebes in 379 BC, Epaminondas was 44 years old. He had 3 years of close observation to work with. Most men would have considered that enough. He considered it a beginning. For the next 7 years, he continued his study. He collected reports from every battle Sparta fought. He interviewed soldiers who had faced them. He drew diagrams of their formations and spent hours alone in his studies staring at those drawings, searching for the pattern. And in 378 BC, 3 years before Leuctra, he found it. The war room in Thebes was a modest space. Stone walls, a wooden table, maps weighted down with daggers to keep them flat. Epaminondas sat alone in the thin light of an oil lamp, surrounded by scrolls that documented 3 centuries of Spartan victories. Thermopylae, Plataea, Mantinea, Coronea, Nemea. The names blurred together, but the geometry underneath them was always the same. Spartan right-wing advances, enemy left-wing collapses. Spartans wheel inward, enemy army disintegrates. The pattern was so consistent, it stopped looking like tactics and started looking like physics, like a law of nature, like gravity. And that's when he understood. They weren't invincible because they were better. They were invincible because they had found a system that worked and then convinced themselves it was divine. They had turned military doctrine into religious ritual. And ritual, no matter how lethal, is predictable. He picked up a stylus and began sketching on a wax tablet, a standard Spartan line, 12 ranks deep, king and royal guard on the far right. The geometry of the drift pulling everything in that direction like water flowing downhill. Every Greek commander who had ever faced Sparta had looked at this formation and asked the same question. How do we avoid their right wing? How do we keep our left flank from being where they're strongest? Epaminondas asked a different question. What if we don't avoid it? What if we hit their strength with greater strength? What if we concentrate everything we have into a single point and drive it straight through the place they think is impenetrable? He drew the counter formation. A grotesquely deep column on the left, 50 ranks instead of 12. Not a wall, a fist, aimed directly at the Spartan king. The cost of this idea was immediate and brutal. To build that kind of mass on one wing, he would have to hollow out the rest of his line. His center would be dangerously thin. His right would be skeletal. If those sections tried to fight a conventional engagement, they would be overwhelmed in minutes. This wasn't a balanced battle plan. It was a controlled demolition. Everything depended on one strike landing before the rest of the structure collapsed. He stared at the diagram for a long time, testing it mentally, looking for flaws, trying to find the place where the logic broke down. It held. The mathematics were sound. 50 ranks of men compressed into a narrow front would generate a force the Spartan right wing had never been designed to absorb, not because Spartans lacked courage, not because their training was inadequate, but because human bodies have physical limits, and physics doesn't care about reputation. He set down the stylus. The theory was complete. Now he just needed Sparta to give him the opportunity to test it, and a chance to convince his own officers that he hadn't lost his mind. That chance came in the spring of 371 BC. Sparta, confident as always in its ability to enforce its will through the implicit threat of military action, demanded that Thebes submit to its authority. The Thebans refused. Negotiations collapsed. War became inevitable, and both armies began marching toward the plain of Leuctra. Inside the Theban camp, panic spread like disease. The Boeotian League allies who had agreed to march with Thebes began whispering about retreat. Some talked openly about abandoning the field before the fighting started. These men had grown up hearing stories about what happened to armies that faced Sparta on open ground. They knew those stories always ended the same way, with corpses piled in heaps and survivors begging for permission to collect their dead. Epaminondas called a war council on the night before the battle. Officers crowded into his tent, their faces tight with barely controlled fear. Maps were spread across a wooden table. Beyond the canvas walls, thousands of nervous men tried to sleep and failed. Everyone in that tent knew what the morning would bring. The bone flutes, the red cloaks, the inexorable advance of the formation that had never lost. Epaminondas waited until the tent was silent. Then he began to speak. His voice was calm, almost gentle. The voice of a teacher explaining a difficult concept to students who wanted to understand but couldn't quite see the answer yet. He told them that Sparta was not invincible, that their reputation was built on a foundation of predictable tactics and psychological intimidation, that every army they had ever faced had made the same mistake. They had accepted Sparta's own mythology about themselves. They had believed the lie that Spartan warriors were somehow fundamentally different from other men, harder, stronger, blessed by gods. But Sparta's warriors were just men, men who followed patterns, men who had spent 300 years doing the same thing over and over because it kept working. And the moment you see a pattern, you can exploit it. Then he showed them the plan. The 50-rank deep column on the left wing. The thin center and right that would refuse engagement. The concentration of all their strength into a single devastating punch aimed at the one point Sparta had never bothered to heavily defend because they had never needed to. Their king. The officers stared at the diagram in horrified silence. Then the objections began. All at once. Overlapping. Desperate. You're exposing our flanks. If the left fails, we're annihilated. No one stacks that deep. It violates every tactical principle we know. The Spartans will see it and adjust. Our center will collapse before the left can accomplish anything. This is insane. This is suicide. This is going to get us all killed. Epaminondas let them exhaust themselves. Then he spoke again. Still calm, still certain. He explained that the Spartan king would be on their right wing, that physics guaranteed it. The drift was not a choice. It was built into the structure of the phalanx itself, and the Spartans had never tried to correct it because they had turned it into their greatest weapon. So they would position their elite forces exactly where he expected them to, because they always had, because they always would, because 300 years of success had calcified their tactics into ritual. And he explained that 12 ranks could not punch through elite Spartan fighters. But 50 could, because at a certain depth, combat stopped being about skill and started being about mathematics, about mass, about pressure that human bodies simply could not resist no matter how brave or well-trained they were. And he explained that his center and right didn't need to win their sections. They just needed to survive, to delay, to refuse full engagement while the decisive blow landed. If the king fell, if the Spartan right wing broke, the psychological impact would shatter their entire army. Because Sparta's power wasn't just military, it was mythological. And myths die hard and fast when you kill them in front of witnesses. The tent was quiet for a long time. Then one by one the officers began to nod. Not because they fully believed, but because the alternative was retreat. And retreat meant living under Spartan domination forever. At least this plan offered the ghost of a chance. At least this man had spent a decade preparing for this moment, while they had spent that same decade trying not to think about it. Epaminondas dismissed them to prepare their units. He sat alone in the tent for a while after they left, staring at the map, testing the plan one more time in his mind, looking for the flaw he might have missed, the variable he hadn't accounted for. But the logic held. The theory was sound. Tomorrow would prove whether theory could survive contact with bronze and blood. He extinguished the lamp. Outside, the camp was settling into an uneasy sleep. Across the plain, perhaps 2 miles distant, Spartan campfires burned in neat, disciplined rows. Those men were sleeping soundly, confident, untroubled. They had done this before. They knew how it ended. Epaminondas closed his eyes, but he did not sleep. He spent the night running through the sequence of commands he would need to give. The timing, the triggers, the moment when he would commit everything to the attack and accept that there would be no retreat. No second chance. Just the mathematics of 50 ranks against 12. And the hope that 300 years of invincibility had made Sparta too arrogant to imagine that anyone would be crazy enough to attack their strength head-on. Dawn came cold and clear. The plain of Leuctra stretched flat and featureless under a sky that promised heat by midday. Epaminondas walked through the Theban camp as his men assembled. He did not give speeches, did not try to inspire them with talk of glory or freedom. He simply moved among them, checking equipment, offering quiet corrections, making sure each unit knew its role. The sacred band formed up at the head of the left wing. 300 men, the finest fighters Thebes possessed. They had trained together for years, fought together in a dozen smaller engagements, never been defeated. Their armor gleamed, their shields were freshly painted. Their eyes were hard and focused. These were the men who would strike first, who would absorb the initial impact, who would be dead in an hour if the theory was wrong. Epaminondas stopped in front of them. For a moment he said nothing, just looked at the faces of men who had trusted him enough to stand at the point of a formation that every tactical manual in Greece would call suicide. Then he spoke. His voice was quiet enough that only the front ranks could hear. You are the tip of the spear. Behind you, 49 ranks of your brothers will push. You will not break. Not because you are braver than other men, but because the weight behind you will make breaking physically impossible. Your task is simple. Advance, reach the Spartan king, and kill the idea that Sparta cannot be beaten on open ground. He turned and walked to his own position. Fifth rank, not in front where commanders traditionally stood to inspire their men, but deep enough in the column that he would feel the pressure building, that he would know the exact moment when mass overcame resistance and the physics took over. Across the plain, the Spartan army was assembling, and everything Epaminondas had predicted was coming true. King Cleombrotus was positioning himself on the right wing. The royal guard was forming around him. The rest of the line was extending to the left in the standard depth. 12 ranks, perfectly disciplined, supremely confident. They had seen the odds stacking on the Theban left. Their scouts had reported it. But to Spartan eyes, it looked like fear, a nervous attempt to shore up the wing that would face the king, the kind of desperate defensive measure that weak cities always tried before they died. It wasn't threatening. It was pathetic. Cleombrotus gave the order to advance. The bone flutes began their thin, cold shriek. 1,700 shields slammed together in unison. And the killing machine that had dominated Greece for 3 centuries started forward with the confidence of men who had never lost and saw no reason to believe today would be different. On the Theban side, Epaminondas gave his own orders. The left wing, 50 ranks deep and already moving, accelerated into a steady jog. The center and right, thin and nervous, began a slower advance. The timing had to be perfect. The left had to hit first, had to smash into the Spartan right before the rest of the battle developed. Everything depended on the next 10 minutes. The distance between the armies closed. 500 meters, 300, 200. Close enough now to see individual faces. Close enough to hear the Spartan battle chant cutting through the sound of thousands of feet striking dry earth. Close enough that there was no turning back. Epaminondas felt the men around him pressing closer, the formation compressing as it accelerated. The awful, exhilarating moment when theory stops being abstract and becomes flesh and bronze, and the very real possibility that he had miscalculated and was about to die along with everyone who had trusted him. The Theban cavalry hit first, a sudden violent clash on the flanks as horsemen collided. The Thebans had better cavalry, they always had, and they used that advantage now, scattering the Spartan riders and driving them backward into the path of their own advancing infantry. Spartan hoplites stumbled as panicked horses crashed through their front ranks. The perfect cadence broke for just a moment. Shields were knocked aside. Men cursed and shoved, trying to reform. And in that moment of disruption, while the Spartan front line was still recovering its footing, the Theban left wing arrived. The collision was instantaneous and total. Shield against shield, bronze against bronze. The front ranks of both armies crashing together with a sound like the world breaking. Spears thrust over the tops of shields, hunting for throats and eyes in the soft gaps in armor. Men screamed, cursed, died in the first 3 seconds. But the Spartans held, because of course they held. This was what they had trained for since childhood. The shock of impact, the pressure of shields grinding against your chest, the narrow, suffocating reality of formation combat where you couldn't see more than 3 feet in any direction and had to trust that the men around you were doing their jobs while you did yours. They dug in their heels, locked their shields, pushed back against the Theban pressure, and for perhaps 5 seconds the line held stable. A contest of strength and will between 2 forces that seemed evenly matched. Then the weight arrived, 45 ranks behind the sacred band, still moving forward and unable to see the collision ahead, driven by orders and momentum and the press of men behind them. They slammed into the backs of the fighters at the front, adding their mass to the equation. And then the ranks behind them hit, and the ranks behind them. And the Spartans, for the first time in 300 years, felt what it was like to face a force they could not physically resist. The front rank fighters were crushed against their own shields. Their feet began to slide backward in the dust, not because they were afraid, not because their courage failed, but because 50 ranks of human weight pushing from behind generates a pressure that 12 ranks cannot match. Physics, mathematics, the cold equations of mass and force that don't care about training or tradition or the stories men tell themselves about who they are. The Spartan line began to bow inward, slowly at first, inches, then faster. The perfect formation that had held against every enemy for 3 centuries was bending under a kind of pressure it had never been designed to absorb. Inside the crush, men were dying in ways that had nothing to do with weapons. The pressure was so intense that some fighters couldn't expand their lungs to breathe. They suffocated standing upright, held in place by the bodies packed around them. Shields jammed at wrong angles and became instruments of torture instead of protection. Spears tangled together in useless clusters. The dead couldn't fall. There was no room. They stayed vertical, pinned between the living, their weight adding to the chaos. Epaminondas, deep in the fifth rank, felt the moment when resistance shifted to collapse. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden breakthrough, just a subtle change in the pressure against his back. A fractional increase in forward momentum. The feeling of a door that had been stuck finally starting to swing open. He shouted the order. Keep pushing. Maintain the rhythm. Don't let up. The men in front couldn't hear him over the screaming and the clash of bronze, but the men around him could, and they passed the command forward through physical pressure as much as words. Push, step, push, step. The brutal simplicity of a battering ram in human form. At the tip of the formation, the sacred band was carving through Spartan royal guardsmen with mechanical precision. These were not wild fighters. They didn't rage or charge recklessly. They advanced in perfect coordination, shields, locked spears working in rhythm. Each pair of fighters covering for their partner in movements they had drilled 10,000 times. And behind them, the mass kept building, kept pushing, kept applying pressure that no amount of individual skill could counter. King Cleombrotus was fighting in the front rank because Spartan tradition demanded it. He was 45 years old, a veteran of a dozen campaigns. He had stood in this position before and watched enemy formations break apart like waves against stone. He knew exactly what was supposed to happen. The initial shock of contact, the brief moment of chaos, then the steady grinding advance as Spartan discipline proved superior to whatever desperate courage the enemy had mustered. But this time the script was different. His men were being pushed backward, not routing, not breaking, just giving ground inch by terrible inch under a pressure that should not exist. He could feel the formation bowing around him, could hear the strain in the voices of his guardsmen as they fought to hold a line that physics was slowly crushing. He tried to rally them, shouted that they were Sparta, that they had never lost, that they would not lose now. But his voice was lost in the chaos of bronze and screaming and the awful sound of men choking on their own blood. Then a spear found the gap between his breastplate and his shoulder guard. The thrust came from somewhere ahead, invisible in the press of bodies delivered by a sacred band fighter who would never know whose life he had just ended. The blade punched through muscle and scraped along bone and kept going until it lodged deep in the king's chest cavity. Cleombrotus gasped, tried to raise his shield, couldn't. The strength was draining from his arm with horrifying speed. He staggered. And in that moment of weakness, the men around him made a choice that would have been unthinkable 5 minutes earlier. They abandoned the formation. The Royal Guard elite fighters who had been trained since childhood, never to break ranks under any circumstances, turned away from the enemy to protect their king. Some grabbed Cleombrotus under the arms and started dragging him backward. Others formed a protective pocket around him, shields raised against the Theban spears that were suddenly everywhere. The perfect Spartan wall, the formation that had terrified Greece for 3 centuries, cracked open to save one dying man. And the Thebans poured through the gap like water through a broken dam. What happened next would have seemed impossible to anyone watching from a distance. The Spartan right wing, the most dangerous military formation in the known world, began to come apart. Not all at once, not in a clean break, but in a spreading disintegration that started at the point where the king had fallen and rippled outward in both directions. Men who had been trained to stand and die rather than retreat found themselves in a situation their training had never covered. The formation was dissolving around them. The king was down, maybe dead. The unit cohesion that made individual Spartans deadly was evaporating into isolated pockets of desperate fighting. And ahead of them, the Theban column just kept coming. Relentless, unstoppable. A force of pure mass and momentum that crushed everything in its path. Some Spartans held their ground and died where they stood fighting with the suicidal courage that had made them legendary. Others tried to pull back in some semblance of order, stepping backward in tight groups with shields still facing the enemy. And some, faced with the choice between certain death and the unthinkable shame of survival, dropped their shields and ran. That last group was small, maybe 24 men out of 700, but their existence was enough because for 300 years Sparta had built its entire identity on the idea that Spartans did not run, could not run, would rather than show their backs to an enemy. The official Spartan saying repeated endlessly to boys in the agoge was simple: come back with your shield or on it, meaning victorious or dead. There was no third option. Running was not death. It was something worse than death. It was the erasure of everything that made a Spartan worth being. And yet here they were, red cloaks disappearing into the dust, shields abandoned in the dirt, Spartan warriors running for their lives like any other defeated soldiers. The psychological impact was more devastating than the physical casualties. Across the battlefield, Allied troops fighting for Sparta on the left and center wings could see the impossible happening. The Spartan right was in retreat. The formation that was supposed to carry the entire battle was breaking apart. And if Sparta could break, what hope did anyone else have? The rout spread. Not instantly, but fast enough. Allied units that had been holding their ground against the thin Theban center and right suddenly decided that survival was more important than loyalty. They began pulling back, then withdrawing more quickly, then running outright as panic became contagious, and the entire Spartan battle line started to dissolve from the right flank inward like a rope unraveling. Epaminondas felt the resistance collapse. The pressure against his shield suddenly decreased. The mass in front of him was no longer pushing back with organized force, but fragmenting into individual targets. He gave the order to slow the advance. Not stop, slow, maintain formation. Keep the pressure on, but don't chase scattered enemies into traps or ambushes. This was the moment when many generals would have ordered a full pursuit, would have tried to maximize the carnage by running down fleeing soldiers and turning a victory into an annihilation. But Epaminondas was not most generals. He understood that what he had achieved today was more valuable than a high body count. He had killed a myth. And myths die hardest when you force the survivors to live with the knowledge of what happened. The Theban left wing ground to a halt. Around them, the battlefield was littered with the evidence of catastrophe. Bodies in red cloaks, Spartan shields face down in the dust, scattered weapons, the wounded crying for help in the peculiar afternoon silence that follows intense violence. The air smelled like bronze and blood and shit, and everywhere the evidence that the impossible had occurred. Epaminondas moved forward through the ranks, stepping over bodies until he could see the full scope of what had happened. The Spartan right wing was gone, not destroyed completely, but shattered beyond any hope of quick recovery. The survivors were pulling back in scattered groups, no longer a formation, no longer an army. Just frightened men trying to put distance between themselves and the force that had broken them. He turned to look at his own casualties. The sacred band had paid a terrible price for being at the tip of the spear. 47 men dead, another dozen wounded badly enough that they would never fight again. But the unit had held, had done exactly what he had asked, had proven that courage and coordination could survive even the most brutal physics of mass combat. The Theban center and right wings, which had executed their delaying tactics perfectly, had lost fewer men. They had bent without breaking, had given ground without collapsing, had bought the time needed for the left wing to complete its work. Total Theban casualties were perhaps 300 dead and twice that wounded. Significant, painful, but sustainable. The Spartan losses were different in kind, not just degree. As evening approached and the fighting definitively ended, the scale of the disaster became clear. Approximately 400 Spartiates were dead, out of 700 who had marched to Leuctra that morning. More than half of Sparta's citizen soldiers killed in a single afternoon. For any other Greek city, that would have been a catastrophic blow. For Sparta, with its uniquely small citizen population and its total dependence on maintaining a trained warrior elite, it was existential. The Spartan system could not function without a critical mass of full citizens to control the vastly larger population of helots and subject peoples. And in one afternoon, Epaminondas had gutted that critical mass. But the physical casualties were only the beginning. What came next would be worse, because Epaminondas understood that defeating Sparta required more than killing their soldiers. It required destroying the narrative that sustained them, the story they told themselves about who they were. the myth that made other cities surrender before the fighting even started. And the best way to destroy that myth was to make Sparta beg. As the sun began setting on the battlefield, a Spartan herald approached the Theban lines under a flag of truce. He was an older man, too old to fight in the phalanx, but still bound by duty to serve. His face was carefully neutral, but his eyes were dead. He knew what he was about to do, knew what it meant. Greek tradition had a protocol for this moment. The army that held the battlefield when the fighting ended was the winner. The army that sent a herald to request permission to collect their dead was the loser. It was a formal public admission of defeat. Once you made that request, everyone in Greece would know you had lost. There was no ambiguity, no way to spin the narrative. You had begged, therefore you had been beaten. For 300 years, Sparta had been the side granting those requests, never making them. The psychological weight of that unbroken record was enormous. And now, for the first time in living memory, a Spartan herald was crossing a battlefield to perform the ritual of submission. He reached the Theban lines and asked to speak with Epaminondas. When the general appeared, the herald delivered his message. He asked for a truce to recover the bodies of the fallen, and he phrased the request carefully using language that attributed it to the Allied coalition as a whole rather than to Sparta specifically. A small, desperate attempt to dilute the shame. Epaminondas listened in silence. Then he refused. He told the herald that the request was not clear, that he needed to know exactly who was asking for this truce. And he waited, not cruelly, not with triumph, just with the patient certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was forcing to happen. The herald closed his eyes for a moment. Then he spoke again, this time with the proper formulation. Sparta requests a truce to recover its fallen. Sparta specifically and explicitly was asking permission from Thebes. Only then did Epaminondas agree. The truce was granted. Spartan soldiers could enter the field to collect their dead. But there was one condition. The bodies had to be sorted. Spartiate citizens on one side, Allied troops on the other. A public accounting of exactly how much irreplaceable Spartan blood had been spilled on this ground. The next day, as soldiers moved across the battlefield collecting corpses, everyone could see the audit. The piles of bodies sorted by origin. The visual proof of Sparta's losses. 400 Spartiate citizens. The number was specific, undeniable, and it would spread across Greece faster than any messenger could carry it. Every city that had submitted to Sparta out of fear would hear that number and recalculate their odds. Every enslaved population would hear it and begin to hope. Epaminondas stood watching the grim work from a distance. One of his officers approached and asked what would come next, whether they should pursue the retreating Spartans, whether they should press their advantage while the enemy was still reeling. Epaminondas shook his head. The battle was won, he said, but the war was just starting, and the next phase would require patience, not speed. He looked south toward Sparta, toward the city that had never needed walls because its warriors had been wall enough, toward the system that had dominated Greece for longer than any man alive could remember. That system was still intact, damaged but not destroyed. The real victory would come from dismantling the foundations that had made Sparta possible in the first place, because Epaminondas understood something that would take his enemies years to realize. Sparta's military power wasn't generated by superior courage or divine favor. It was produced by a specific economic structure, by the labor of hundreds of thousands of enslaved helots who worked the fields and generated the surplus that allowed Spartan citizens to spend their entire lives training for war. Take away the helots and the warrior class would collapse. Make the Spartans work their own land and they would have no time for constant military drilling. Force them to choose between farming and fighting, and the machine that had terrorized Greece for 3 centuries would simply stop functioning. That would be the real victory, not killing Spartans on a battlefield, but killing the system that created Spartans in the first place. And for that, Epaminondas would need more than one afternoon. He would need years, invasions, the liberation of peoples who had been enslaved for so long they had almost forgotten what freedom meant. The sun set on Leuctra, the bodies were collected. The Spartans withdrew with their dead carrying the news of catastrophe home to a city that had never had to process this kind of loss before. And Epaminondas returned to Thebes, already planning the next phase of a campaign that would end not with Sparta's defeat, but with its permanent reduction to irrelevance. The myth had been wounded at Leuctra. Soon it would be killed completely. And the weapon that would deliver that final blow was already being prepared. The news reached Sparta during a festival. Religious ceremonies were underway, sacrifices being made, dancing and singing in the streets to honor gods who, according to the state theology, favored Spartan warriors above all other men. The city was celebrating its own supposed divinity when a dust-covered messenger arrived with word that the divine was dead. The ephors, Sparta's ruling magistrates, received the report in private. King Cleombrotus dead, 400 Spartiates killed. The army in retreat, defeated, by Thebes, on open ground, in exactly the kind of battle Sparta had never lost. In any other Greek city, news like this would have shattered the festival instantly. People would have torn their clothes, filled the streets with wailing. The public spaces would have become theaters of visible grief. But Sparta was not any other city. And Spartan law had specific requirements about how citizens were supposed to respond to military casualties. The ephors made a decision that revealed just how deeply the system had warped the people trapped inside it. They ordered the festival to continue. No public announcement of the defeat, no acknowledgement of the dead. The celebrations would proceed as planned, and the families of the fallen would be expected to maintain appropriate composure, because Spartan law stated clearly that open grief for men killed in battle was forbidden. A son who died fighting was supposed to be a source of pride, not sorrow. The only families permitted to weep in public were those whose sons had come home alive in disgrace. Death in battle was honor. Survival without victory was shame. The law was explicit, and the law supposedly handed down by the semi-divine lawgiver Lycurgus centuries ago could not be violated. So the festival continued. And as news of Leuctra spread through the city, family by family, household by household, Sparta performed one of the most grotesque emotional inversions in military history. Mothers who learned their sons were dead forced themselves to appear in public with straight backs and composed faces. Some managed expressions that could almost pass for pride. Their boys had held the line. Their boys had not run. That was supposed to be enough. That was supposed to be the correct response. Meanwhile, mothers of survivors lowered their heads, covered their faces, carried visible shame. Because if there was even a whisper of doubt about whether their sons had fought courageously, the entire family would bear the mark of cowardice. In Sparta's moral universe, it was better to have a dead hero than a living son whose courage could be questioned. Behind closed doors, the reality was different. Grief that could not be expressed publicly had to go somewhere. Wives who wanted to rage at the generals who had led their husbands into a trap had to swallow every word. Parents who wanted to mourn had to do it in silence and darkness where neighbors could not hear. The entire city became a performance of strength concealing an ocean of suppressed anguish. But the emotional damage was only part of Sparta's crisis. The military arithmetic was worse. The city had started the day with approximately 1,500 adult male citizens. It ended with 1,100. That loss of 400 men might have been recoverable for a normal city with a normal population structure. But Sparta's citizen body had been declining for generations. Casualty rates from constant warfare, strict citizenship requirements, an economic system that made it difficult for poorer Spartans to maintain their status. The population had been eroding slowly for a century. Leuctra had just accelerated the collapse. And then there was the problem of the Trisantes, the tremblers, the official designation for Spartans who had shown cowardice in battle. Sparta had a specific legal framework for dealing with these men. They lost their citizenship. They were required to wear specially marked clothing that advertised their shame. They could be insulted publicly without recourse. They became living ghosts, socially dead, walking reminders of what happened to men who broke. After Leuctra, the potential pool of Trisantes was enormous. In the chaos of the collapsing right wing, no one could verify every individual action. Rumors moved faster than truth. This man was seen turning his back. That one abandoned his position. Another was spotted without his shield. The accusations multiplied. And in a system as rigid as Sparta's, context was irrelevant. The law did not ask why. It only asked what happened. But Sparta now faced an impossible dilemma. They could apply the law strictly and brand dozens, maybe hundreds of survivors as cowards. Or they could preserve what remained of their military strength by finding some way to rehabilitate men who under normal circumstances would have been permanently exiled from citizen status. The decision fell to King Agesilaus, the elder Spartan king, who had not been present at Leuctra. He was in his 60s, a veteran of half a century of warfare, a man who had spent his entire life inside the system and believed deeply in its principles. But he was also pragmatic enough to understand that strict adherence to the law would cripple Sparta at exactly the moment when it could least afford weakness. Ancient sources describe his solution with a phrase that cuts to the bone. For one day the laws of Lycurgus would sleep. The eternal, unchangeable, divinely ordained laws that had supposedly governed Sparta for centuries would be temporarily suspended. Some of the men who should have been branded as tracentes were quietly rehabilitated. Some classifications were adjusted. Some accusations were allowed to fade without formal judgment. It was a practical decision, possibly the only decision that made military sense. But it was also an admission that destroyed something fundamental. Because if the laws of Lycurgus could be bent when they became inconvenient, then they were not divine. They were not eternal. They were just rules, enforced by men, changeable by men, breakable by men when circumstances demanded it. The system had eaten itself. The rigid code that supposedly made Sparta superior to other cities had proven to be as flexible and self-serving as any other political structure when survival required compromise. And everyone who participated in that compromise, everyone who watched it happen and stayed silent, understood what it meant. The mythology was cracking. The foundation was unsound. Sparta was not special. It was just another city with frightened people and leaders willing to violate their own sacred principles when the alternative was annihilation. But Epaminondas was not finished. Leuctra had broken Sparta's military reputation. Now he would break the economic system that sustained it, and he would do it with the same patient, methodical precision he had brought to the battlefield. 2 years after Leuctra, in the winter of 370 BC, Epaminondas led a coalition army into the Peloponnese. The stated objective was to punish Sparta and liberate its subject peoples. But the real goal was more specific, more devastating. He was going to do something that no hostile force had managed in recorded Greek history. He was going to invade Laconia, the Spartan heartland. For centuries, Sparta had kept enemy armies at a distance through a combination of military reputation and favorable geography. Mountains to the north, hostile terrain on every approach, and the psychological weight of confronting Sparta on its own ground. No one wanted to be the general who led his army to destruction in sight of Spartan walls. No one had been willing to take that risk. Until now. The Theban-led coalition marched south, through Arcadia, past cities that had lived under Spartan domination for generations, and watched in disbelief as foreign soldiers moved through territory that was supposed to be inviolate. The psychological impact was immediate. Sparta's aura of invincibility, already damaged at Leuctra, was evaporating completely. They could be invaded. Their homeland could be violated. The threat that had kept subject peoples obedient for 300 years was revealed as hollow. Spartan citizens watched from their unwalled city as enemy campfires appeared on the hills around them. Villages burned, fields were trampled. The landscape that had never felt a foreign boot was suddenly occupied by thousands of soldiers who had no fear of Spartan reprisal, because everyone now knew what had happened at Leuctra. Everyone had seen the audit of Spartan dead, and no one believed anymore that fighting Sparta meant automatic death. Epaminondas did not assault the city itself. He did not need to. The humiliation of the invasion was sufficient, the proof that Sparta could be hurt on its own ground, the demonstration that their military power was finite and declining. He let the presence of his army do the psychological work. Then he turned west, toward Messenia, toward the real target. Messenia was the foundation of Spartan power, a rich agricultural region that had been conquered by Sparta centuries ago and turned into a massive forced labor camp. The Messenian population, numbering over 200,000, had been enslaved and classified as helots. They worked the fields, produced the grain, generated the economic surplus that allowed a small population of Spartan citizens to spend their entire lives training for war instead of farming for food. Without Messenian helots, the Spartan system could not function. It was that simple. Take away the forced labor, and the warrior class would have to choose between eating and fighting. Make them work their own land, and they would have no time for the constant drilling that made them effective. Force them to act like normal Greeks who had to balance military service with economic survival, and the machine that had terrorized a continent would simply stop working. Epaminondas marched his army to Mount Ithome, a defensible height sacred to the Messenians. And there, with Theban military support and Boeotian resources, he helped the Messenian people do something they had not been able to do for 3.5 centuries. He helped them build a city, a fortified, defensible, permanent city with walls thick enough to withstand siege. He gathered exiles who had fled Spartan control, brought in refugees, organized the Helot population, and declared them free, citizens of an independent state under Theban protection. No longer property of Sparta, the economic impact was immediate and catastrophic. Sparta lost approximately half of its agricultural base overnight. The fields that had fed Spartan households for generations now fed Messenian families. The forced labor that had subsidized the warrior lifestyle was gone, and there was nothing Sparta could do about it. They did not have the military strength to retake Messenia by force. Not anymore. Not after Leuctra, not with their citizen population gutted and their reputation destroyed. Spartan citizens who had never worked a field in their lives suddenly found themselves facing a choice their ancestors had not confronted in centuries. Starve or farm, maintain the old lifestyle and watch your children go hungry, or compromise the system and survive. There was no third option. The machine was breaking down, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, inevitably, like a structure slowly collapsing under its own weight once the foundation was removed. Epaminondas also helped establish another fortified city in Arcadia, Megalopolis, the great city, positioned to block any northern expansion Sparta might attempt. Another permanent check on their power. Another reminder that the days of Spartan hegemony were over. The Peloponnese was being restructured, and Sparta was being contained. Surrounded by free cities with strong walls and no fear of red-cloaked warriors who had proven to be mortal after all. This was the architecture of total victory, not the dramatic annihilation of a single battle, but the patient dismantling of every system that had made the enemy powerful. The economic base, the subject populations, the psychological intimidation, the narrative of invincibility. Piece by piece, Epaminondas was deleting Sparta from the map of significant Greek powers. And then he went back to being a private citizen, because that was his nature. He did not seek tyranny or permanent command. He served when Thebes needed him, returned to civilian life when the campaign ended, lived simply, studied philosophy, remained the same calm, precise analyst he had always been, the man who had killed a god and then went home to read and think and prepare for the next time his city called on him. That call came again 9 years later. In 362 BC, at a place called Mantinea, Epaminondas led another coalition army against a force that included Spartans and their new allies. He was 61 years old, ancient by the standards of active campaigning, but his mind was still sharp, his tactical sense still precise. And when the battle began, he used a refined version of the same principles that had worked at Leuctra: concentration of force, attack the enemy's strength with greater strength, discipline over confidence, mathematics over mythology, and he won. Again, the enemy line broke. Again, the coalition forces retreated. The victory was complete, but this time it cost Epaminondas everything. During the fighting, a spear thrust caught him in the chest. The blade punched through his breastplate and lodged deep near his heart. His men carried him off the field while the battle was still raging, laid him on the ground, called for surgeons who took one look at the wound and knew the truth. The spearhead was buried too deep. Removing it would almost certainly kill him instantly. Leaving it in would kill him slowly. There was no third option. He was dying. The only question was how fast. Epaminondas was conscious, clear-eyed. He understood what was happening. And before the surgeons could make any decisions, he asked a single question. Did we win? An officer standing nearby confirmed it. The enemy was in retreat. The battle was won. The coalition forces controlled the field. They had achieved their objective. Victory was complete. Epaminondas closed his eyes for a moment. Then he gave an order. He gave and he pulled the spear out. The surgeons hesitated, tried to argue, but he was firm, calm. The battle was won. His work was done. There was no reason to draw this out. Remove the blade. Let it end. They obeyed. The spearhead came free. Blood followed. A lot of it. Epaminondas's breathing became shallow, ragged. Someone standing nearby, an officer or friend, made a comment that was probably meant as comfort but came out as grief. He said that Epaminondas was dying without sons to carry on his name, without family to remember him, without the bloodline continuity that Greek culture valued so deeply. Epaminondas opened his eyes one last time, and according to ancient sources, he spoke his final words. He said that he was leaving behind two daughters, Leuctra and Mantinea, his victories, his ideas, the proof that the unbeatable could be beaten if you studied them long enough and had the courage to attack their strength instead of avoiding it. That was his legacy, not children, not blood, but the permanent demonstration that mythology yields to mathematics, that systems can be understood, that invincibility is always a lie. He died minutes later, and the news of his death spread across Greece almost as fast as the news of his victories. The man who had broken Sparta, who had liberated Messenia, who had proven that 300 years of dominance could be ended in a single well-planned afternoon. Gone. Thebes tried to hold on to the supremacy Epaminondas had won for them, but they lacked his strategic vision, his patience, his ability to see conflicts in terms of systems rather than just battles. Within a generation, a new power would rise from the north, Macedon, led by a king who had spent part of his youth as a hostage in Thebes, who had watched Epaminondas train troops and plan campaigns, who had studied the innovations that won Leuctra and Mantinea. His name was Philip II, and he would refine everything he learned into something even more devastating. Philip took the concept of concentrated mass and combined it with longer spears, the sarissa, pikes that turned the phalanx into an even more crushing instrument of force. He added heavy cavalry that could exploit breakthroughs more effectively than Greek horsemen ever had. He created a combined arms system that dominated battlefields through superior coordination and training. And when he was assassinated, his son inherited that system and used it to conquer the Persian Empire. Alexander the Great's victories at the Granicus River, at Issus, at Gaugamela, all bore the fingerprints of ideas that had been born at Leuctra. The oblique order, the concentration of force at the decisive point, the willingness to stake everything on a single devastating blow, aimed at the enemy's strength rather than their weakness. Epaminondas's tactical legacy crossed 3 continents and reshaped the ancient world. As for Sparta, they never recovered. The liberation of Messenia was permanent. The economic base never returned. The citizen population continued to decline. By the time Rome conquered Greece centuries later, Sparta had become a tourist attraction, a place where rich Romans could watch carefully choreographed displays of traditional Spartan training, mock battles, staged demonstrations of the agoge, a living museum of a military culture that had died at Leuctra and never quite realized it was gone. The irony would have appealed to Epaminondas, that the myth outlived the reality by 2,000 years, that people still told stories about Spartan invincibility long after the system that produced it had collapsed, that the reputation persisted even though the substance had been deleted by a 51-year-old philosopher who spent a decade studying their habits and then designed a single formation to exploit them. There are lessons in this story that transcend ancient Greek warfare, lessons about the danger of success that calcifies into ritual, about systems that mistake consistency for superiority, about the way 300 years of winning can make you blind to the patterns that define your victories, about the vulnerability that comes from never having to adapt because you have never needed to. Every undefeated champion eventually faces someone who has studied them longer than they have studied themselves. Every invincible system eventually encounters a mind patient enough to map its weaknesses and bold enough to attack them. Every mythology dies when it meets mathematics. Sparta believed they were divinely favored, that their warriors were fundamentally different from other men, that their system was eternal and unchangeable and perfect. They built that belief over 3 centuries of never losing. And then one afternoon on a plain in Boeotia, a man who understood physics better than mythology stacked 50 ranks of soldiers into a column and drove it straight through the place where the king was standing. And the myth died. The system died. The invincibility died. What survived was the idea, the proof that it could be done. The demonstration that every pattern can be broken if you are willing to study it long enough and strike hard enough at exactly the right place. That lesson traveled from Leuctra to Mantinea to Macedon to Persia to Rome. It is still being taught in military academies today, still being applied in conflicts that would have been unimaginable to Epaminondas, but follow the same fundamental principles he discovered. Study your enemy obsessively. Find the predictable pattern in their success. Attack their strength with greater strength. Maintain discipline when they rely on confidence. And when you win, do not just defeat them on the battlefield. Dismantle the system that made them powerful in the first place. That is the perfect kill, not the one that maximizes casualties, but the one that makes recovery impossible. The one that forces the defeated to live with the knowledge of what happened. The one that changes the story everyone tells about who can be beaten and who cannot. Epaminondas achieved that at Leuctra, and then he spent the next 9 years making sure the lesson was permanent. He invaded Laconia. He liberated Messenia. He built cities that would outlast empires. He created facts on the ground that no amount of Spartan courage could reverse. And when he died, his work was finished. The invincible power had been reduced to irrelevance. The myth had been killed. And the mathematics had proven once and for all to be stronger than the stories men tell themselves about their own immortality. The plain of Leuctra is empty now, just dirt and grass and ancient stones. Tourists sometimes visit, historians study it, military theorists analyze the tactics, but the real monument is not on that field. It is in every subsequent moment when an underdog looked at an unbeatable opponent and thought they said the same thing about Sparta. And Sparta lost, because one man was patient enough to study them, smart enough to understand them, and brave enough to do what everyone else thought was impossible. That is the legacy, not bronze, not marble, but the permanent proof that invincibility is always a lie, and the perfect kill has no expiration date.